Very thrilled to be introducing our next speaker, Naomi Klein, who, great privilege. And I've been told that Powershift is her first speaking gig since becoming a mother, so thank you for being here with us. So, you may know of her already. Naomi Klein is an award-winning journalist, syndicated columnist, and the author of international bestsellers, The Shock Doctrine and No Logo. She is a contributing editor for Harper's. She writes a regular column for The Nation and The Guardian. And in 2004, her reporting from Iraq for Harper's won the James Aronson Award for Social Justice Journalism. She's a member of the board of directors for 350.org with Bill McKibben. And she's currently at work on a new book and a film about how the climate crisis can spur economic and political transformation. Right? So without further ado, we are going to welcome Naomi Klein up to the stage.
Do you guys want to meet Toma? Yeah. Oh. This is Avi, who makes all of this possible.
Otherwise known as Toma Holder.
Not Toma Holder, Avi. Wow. I feel very emotional about being here tonight. Toma's up way past his bedtime, so he may start wailing. But better he wail during my speech than any of the other speeches. So. This is the first speech I've given in many months, except for a short one at a rally against the pipelines and tankers in Vancouver. And I couldn't be more thrilled to be here. I first want to acknowledge that with great gratitude, that we are here on unceded Algonquin territory. I want to thank the organizers of this event, especially Brigitte de Pape for inviting me and for her incredible courage and being such an inspiring young woman. And the volunteers at this conference are unbelievable. I mean, unbelievable. I can't believe it. Thank you so much. I don't think I've ever been to such not just a well-organized conference, but just a lovingly organized conference. People are just so considerate and so warm, and that bodes so well for the kind of movements that we need to build. We need to take care of each other, and you are taking such wonderful care of us. As you heard from Bill, the wonderful Bill McKibben, I had a baby recently. I came to it late in the game, this motherhood thing. Toma was born in June on the banks of the Salish Sea in British Columbia on the Sunshine Coast. And I wanted him to be born there because that's a part of the world I'm very attached to. My family lives there, and I've been visiting there for 20 years and living there on and off. And I wanted him to be connected to that place. And one of the things that's so wonderful about the movement against the tankers and the pipelines on the West Coast is that it is so driven by love. It is a movement that has made people fall more in love with where they live, in articulating why we will not let it be destroyed. So just to give you an idea of what it was like to have a baby on the Sunshine Coast, it's tough. Any new parent will complain about being sleepless, and I certainly am sleep deprived, and will ask you to bear with me. And it's good that we have these sound effects here at the moment. In July, Toma was, I think, 3 weeks old. Avi and I were up at 5 a.m. for probably the 5th feed of the night. We were completely exhausted, feeling very sorry for ourselves, and a little bit of pink was coming through the window blinds, and Avi, in a fit of life affirmation, opened the blinds. It's like, we can't sleep, but at least we can enjoy the sunrise. So we opened the blinds, and Avi looked out and said, holy shit. And we're on the water. We're lucky enough to be on the water. And outside in the bay were two towering black dorsal fins of two orcas. And we went out on the porch with Toma, and we saw two more orcas leaping through the air, clearing the water to meet the others. And it was a family. They were feeding too, maybe on seals. Toma's not on solids yet. And we just watched, just mesmerized, and it was particularly thrilling because I had never seen an orca outside of Marineland when I was a kid, and I'd actually never heard of orcas on that part of the Sunshine Coast, and never so close to shore. So it felt like a miracle. It felt like these whales were coming to greet our son. It felt like, he had woken us just so that we wouldn't miss them, and they were gone by 6 a.m. See, if we had slept, we would have completely missed it. There are benefits to sleeplessness. So this is a beautiful story, and I'm very attached to the story, and I see it as being really a part of the story of my son's life. But something happened a couple of weeks ago that made me rethink it in a way that I'm really troubled by. So what happened is that I read in the newspaper, actually in the Guardian newspaper, a story by our own Martin Lukács, who broke that story, that there had been the, quote, world's biggest geoengineering experiment off the islands of Paraguay, several hundred miles north of where we were on the Sunshine Coast. And what had happened is that this would-be geoengineer named Russ George and his crew had dumped 100 tons of iron dust off the side of a rented fishing boat in the hopes of creating an algae bloom. And there was a twofold goal here. One was to supposedly to bring back the salmon. That's what was promised to the community, that if you create a phytoplankton bloom, then it'll bring zooplankton and all kinds of other creatures that salmon like to eat, and then the salmon will be back. It was, I think, exploiting people's desperation, and they were also told that they would get carbon credits for this, because ocean fertilization is one of the top so-called geoengineering fixes they're often touted, because if you fertilize the ocean and you have a big algae bloom, algae soaks up carbon just like any plant does, and there are people out there who want to be paid money for sequestering carbon in algae, because supposedly it'll sink to the bottom of the ocean and be sequestered there. There's a big debate about whether it really will stay there. But I'll tell you why this relates to the whales in a minute, because they actually claim that they did create a huge algae bloom, half the size of the state of Massachusetts, 10,000 kilometers, and that there was a riot of sea life that came to feed off of the phytoplankton. And they brag that where you used to see, maybe 5 whales a week in this part of the world, now the whales could be counted by the score. And I read this and I thought, wow, those whales I saw were swimming north. It was July, right, when this experiment was going on. I mean, is it so crazy to think that maybe they were on their way? And so this event that I had seen as incredibly beautiful and natural was suddenly recast as something vaguely sinister. And this is just one example of the way that geoengineering, which is increasingly being taken seriously as a solution to climate change because we have failed so spectacularly to embrace real solutions to climate change, which involve getting off fossil fuels. Once we start tampering with the oceans, fertilizing the oceans, or trying to block the sun with sulfur in the stratosphere, or brightening the clouds, we will never view nature in the same way. Bill McKibben wrote a book in 1988 called The End of Nature. And what we will face if we go down this road is something even more terrifying, which is the end of miracles, the end of the idea that there are these incredible random acts that we can't explain, that come to us as gifts. We'll always see the strings being pulled behind the scenes. So I just wanted to start with that story, because I think the fact that geoengineering is being taken seriously, despite the enormous risks. Ocean fertilization may not sequester carbon, but it could well create dead zones in the ocean, toxic tides, more ocean acidification, and the other techniques, blocking the sun through sulfur in the stratosphere. You could imagine a scenario where North America would decide to do that to save their corn crops. And the effect of that, according to many of the computer models that have been done, would be that it would interfere with the Asian and African summer monsoons, and it would put at risk the food supply for billions of people. So, with the flip of the switch, we would have the power to exile billions of people to environmental sacrifice zones. That's the road that we are not inching along. It's happening really, really quickly. So how did we end up here? Where it somehow seems more reasonable to change the color of the sky and the chemical composition of the ocean than to ask someone to take the bus. How did that become reasonable? Now, the movement against climate change is about 24 years old, which is older than most of you in this room, which is really remarkable. It was 1988 when James Hansen first testified before Congress and said that he was almost certain that climate change was happening and that it was human-caused. And plenty of experts knew before then, but that was the moment when the general public could no longer deny that they knew that this was happening. And that was when Bill was writing The End of Nature. So since that point, a lot of people have been trying very hard to do something about this crisis and to build movements that would do that, but it just hasn't worked. And I think there are a couple of reasons I want to talk about. One is, what Bill touched on earlier, which is just the power of the fossil fuel lobby. Again and again, we've seen popular movements rise up to combat climate change. It's not that we haven't tried. We get fired up. We all start to recycle. We start to bicycle. We work like crazy to elect politicians who promise to build an economy based on green jobs and to pass comprehensive energy reform. And we invest our hopes in big, flashy environmental summits in Copenhagen or Rio. And again, this movement has somehow lost momentum and petered out. Why is that? I don't believe it's because, as some people claim, deep down we have some sort of death wish and we don't want to change. I think the problem is that our profound desire to protect life on Earth is a direct threat to Exxon and Shell's desire to remain the most profitable companies on Earth. Their stock price is based on always having in reserve as much as they have in production, and that means that the very thing that we must do to meet this challenge, which is stop the digging, is the very thing they cannot contemplate without staring in the face of their own demise. And it's not just corporations, as we know. Entire countries, like our country, end up waging a wholesale war on truth, attacking scientists and environmental groups simply because the truth challenges their economic paradigm. Faced with such a serious threat to the bottom line, these guys fight like they mean it. Every time the climate movement has gotten its act together, the fossil fuel interests have sent powerful lies into the culture and bankrolled their endless repetition. You know what the lies are: that climate change is a hoax, that climate change will destroy the economy, that you have to choose between a healthy climate and a good job. They've bought politicians, they've blanketed the airwaves, they have attacked our movements from all sides, they have defamed us, they have infiltrated us, and they've, of course, tried to buy us, sometimes successfully. In short, they have behaved as if they are at war, because they are. Not because we hate them, but we really do want an end to their business model, because our survival depends on it. It depends on keeping 80% of their proven reserves in the ground. So they understand this, and they act that way. It's our side the green movement, if you will, that's been kidding itself. For a very long time, the environmental movement has behaved as if climate change was the one issue that didn't have an enemy, okay? Where it was just like, we're all in this together, even Dick Cheney has grandkids, you know, like we just need to raise enough consciousness and then everybody's gonna get on board, right? But here's the thing, we have an enemy. We have a few of them, and we need to start acting like it. And that's, to me, what's been one of the things that's been so amazing about the past year and a half, because we have been reminded by incredible social movements around the world and in this country that it is possible not only to fight but to win. And we're all indebted to the incredible Quebec student movement for teaching us that. We have to be about winning, not just about showing up, not just about making a point, not just about making our voices heard. It's not good enough, not given these stakes. This is a war for the future. It's a war for your future. It's a war for my future. It's a war for my son's future. And I really think that as we talk about how we can connect diverse movements that have been separated, this is something that separates them. You know, you are coming of age in a society at war with your futures, whether it wants to weigh you down with student debt, deny you dignified work, or ravage the natural systems upon which all life depends. All future depends. That's what joins all of this, a war with the future. And I'm so glad to be at an environmental conference. I think for the first time, that is actually talking about the system, not just the symptoms. It's the first time that I can remember, and I want to congratulate you guys because this is a really important moment. You are getting it right after a lot of getting it wrong. So I want to talk about another reason why the legacy of 25 years of climate activism is so disappointing, because it isn't about sort of pointing fingers and saying you did this wrong. A lot of this is just about an accident of history, which is that the climate movement had cosmic bad timing. And I think the reason why we need to understand this is because it helps us shape how we fight and who we're fighting against. And what do I mean by cosmic bad timing? 1988, right? That's when James Hansen testifies before Congress. That's what Bill's writing the first popular book on climate change. 1989, the Berlin Wall falls. End of history is declared. It is the peak of the hegemonic moment for the neoliberal project. It is, what does the end of history mean? It means there are no other ideas. It is a war declared on our imaginations. There is only one model, el modelo, as they say in Latin America, privatization, deregulation, cuts to government spending. You're not allowed to have other ideas. There is no such thing as society. So this crisis hits, which is the essence of a collective crisis. Okay, that can only be responded to with communal action, which has to be responded to with profound regulation, with tough regulation, which needs a strong public sector, whether to build public transit system or to protect us from the ravages of climate change that we're facing already. We need all of this to fight climate change, but yet the issue peaks right or breaks into the public consciousness right when you have a war being waged on precisely those ideas. So an environmental movement comes along, and it is a neoliberal environmental movement. It's an environmental movement that says, okay, we're going to deal with the symptoms, but we're going to try to come up with market-based solutions for it. We're going to try to fit it into this existing paradigm. I don't even think it is about saying shame. I think it's just about understanding that this was really, really bad timing for the Earth. It was really bad timing for you. It was a really hard time to put alternatives in the public, but the tides of history are shifting again. That's this moment. And it's just in the nick of time. It's just in the nick of time. But as we think about how this economic model has changed our public institutions, our regulations, the big P politics sphere, I also think we need to recognize that neoliberalism has changed us, has colonized us, okay? It's changed our brains, it's rewired us in ways that make us, broadly us, maybe not you, but a lot of us, uniquely ill-equipped to deal with this particular crisis. What I mean by that is that our communities, the legacy of 35 years of these policies, means that our communities are fractured, our public institutions are tattered, our attention spans are splintered, our identities are atomized, our political imaginations for so long have been atrophied. And this confluence of events, perhaps more than anything else, explains our failure thus far to respond to the climate crisis with real resilience, rather than layer upon layer of denial. There's lots of examples of this, which is, even just the fact that fundamentally climate change demands that we consume less, right? At its core, we have to shop less. Now, this is coming at the moment of the triumphant moment of shopping, where shopping is about creating your identity, right? And this is what my first book was about, is that the whole triumph of branding was not just about buying things. It was about when all of these other ways of creating self and creating community are failing. Shopping is all that's left. So when you tell people you're going to have to shop less, you're not just telling them that they're not going to have specific things that they want. It's seen as an attack on their identity. And we have to understand this, what it means to organize in the neoliberal era. The other thing is that climate change plays out in an intensely local way, in intensely local landscapes. It's an early blooming of a particular flower, an unusually thin layer of ice on a lake, a late arrival of a migratory bird. And noticing these things, these kinds of subtle changes, requires an intimate connection with a specific ecosystem. And that kind of communion only happens when we know a place deeply, not just as scenery, but also as sustenance, and when local knowledge is passed on with a sense of sacred trust from one generation to the next. Knowledge of that sort, as you all know, is increasingly rare. That is also a legacy of the success, the triumph of the capitalist project. Certainly in the urbanized, industrialized world, we tend to leave our homes lightly for a new job, for a new school, for a new love. And as we do so, we're severed from whatever knowledge of place we managed to communicate at the previous stop, as well as from the knowledge amassed by our ancestors, who very likely were migrants themselves. So it takes something huge, like a Frankenstorm, to get people's attention. So this is part of what we're dealing with. Now, as I lay this out, I realize that this can be scary and dispiriting to talk about these deeper barriers to dealing with the climate crisis, and it can make people feel hopeless, because it means that climate change can't be pried apart from the other major challenges that we face, whether social, political, economic, or spiritual. But here's the really good news. More and more of us are longing for precisely that kind of deep structural change. As the multiple popular uprisings of recent years have shown, millions around the world are forging new ways of doing politics, one that do not just make demands of external forces, but also rebuild frayed communities and help participants to find more humane ways to relate to each other. That was the magic of Occupy Wall Street, of Spain's indignados and the encampments in Tahrir Square, or of the Quebec student movement. And it lives on in countless new movements and experiments and projects. These movements are rebuilding relationships, rebuilding community, and that's crucial in meeting the climate challenge. Now, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to sort of jump ahead here. The idea that the solutions to climate change must be socially and spiritually rewarding in their own right, regardless of their carbon impacts, is central to the success of our meeting this crisis. Because never before have we faced a crisis with such long time lags. It's not like you're going to do something, you're going to cut your carbon footprint and you're going to feel the effects tomorrow. No, we know that we have to live with the effects of the carbon we've already emitted. This is precisely why so many environmentalists say they're taking action not for themselves, but for their children and grandchildren. And as a new mother, I can understand that impulse to say we need to do it for our kids. But I really think that's not good enough. In societies facing as many simultaneous crises as ours, the vast majority will only ever embrace radical change to the way they consume and produce if those changes bring tangible benefits now. And by that I mean greater health, stronger communities, less inequality, less oppression, more fulfilling work, a sense of collective purpose. In other words, we can't say this is just for tomorrow. There have to be rewards that come now, and that is the real benefit of weaving together, of knitting together the movements for economic justice and climate justice. Now, making this political shift is urgent. So long as tackling climate change is seen as some sort of benevolent gift to future generations, the ground will be fertile for corporations and their political surrogates to cast environmental action as some sort of theft from suffering families in the here and now. And we just saw this, most spectacularly from Mitt Romney during the Republican convention, where he said President Obama promised to slow the rise of the oceans and heal the planet. Big laugh. I promise to help you and your family. And that was a terrifying moment because it really does show the appeal of that argument. And even if it doesn't get him the presidency, what we're seeing is that precisely that pitting of the environment versus the economy is working. It's being used by the Canadian government, it's being used by European governments, and they're rolling back whatever meager climate commitments they had made. The bottom line is this: not until we have a plan to heal the planet that also heals our broken selves and our broken communities do we have a hope of preventing this most dire of all crises. And our job is to begin to imagine quickly what that holistic healing process might look like. So just finishing up here, some of you know that my last book, The Shock Doctrine, was about how the right, how elites use crises to push through policies that enrich the 1%, that have nothing to do with the crisis themselves, that have nothing to do with actually fixing the problem that created the crisis, but just using disorientation, fear, to ram through their wish list of policies. And I think that's very relevant here because climate change is a very big crisis indeed, the biggest one we've ever faced, and it is not immune from these types of tactics. Disaster capitalism is alive and well, from carbon markets to geoengineering to the patenting of so-called climate-ready GMO seeds to massive land grabs in Asia, in Africa, and Latin America. Meanwhile, countries racked by climate-related natural disasters find much-needed aid tied to demands that they privatize their assets and give sweetheart deals to investors, which is precisely the sort of stuff that I described in the Shock Doctrine. In other words, disaster capitalism is happening. It will continue to happen in the context of the climate crisis. The real question is, can we respond to this crisis with something else, with another kind of agenda? And there is a precedent for this because the left has seized on moments of crisis, of dislocation, to move populist agendas, not in the way the right does, by steamrolling over democracy and taking advantage of people's panic, but by actually building mass popular movements in those moments. And the best example is obviously after the Great Depression, when the rage at elites after the market crash fueled the demand for a social safety net. And after World War II, when wartime sacrifices galvanized returning veterans to demand a share of the prosperities, and a few of the legacies, though embattled as they are, of these exceptional moments include public health care, old age pensions, subsidized housing, and public funding for the arts. I believe that climate change represents such a historic opportunity, a chance to usher in progressive change, what I've come to think of as the people's shock. We once again have a chance to advance the kind of policies that dramatically improve lives, to close the gap between rich and poor, and reinvigorate democracy from the bottom up. But in a way, it's a race against time. Either this crisis will become an opportunity for an evolutionary leap, a holistic readjustment of our relationship with the natural world, or it will become an opportunity for the biggest disaster capitalism free-for-all in human history, leaving the world ever more brutally cleaved between winners and losers, with storms raging outside the gilded gates of privatized communities. The good news is that if we recognize the potential of this moment, we have the chance to avoid that fate. When I wrote the Shock Doctrine, I was documenting past crimes. This is a crime in progress. It is within our power to stop it. As we inevitably change in the face of crisis, and we will, let's make sure the good guys win this time. Thank you.